Hi everyone, and welcome to the latest CTO Craft Bytes on Thursday, the 14th of May, 2020. Today we're looking at critical judgments for CTOs in the current recession with David Subar. If this is your first time at CTO Craft, let me tell you a little bit more about this group. CTO Craft is a mentoring and coaching community for technology leaders around the world, focusing on supporting technologists in their leadership growth. This community numbers are over 1,000 and provide one-on-one coaching, mentoring groups, an online community, and events like this one. So today I'm emceeing today's Byte session. I'm Glyn, the CTO of Digital Solutions at iTech Art. Our speaker today is David Subar. He's the managing partner at Interna and is a member of the board of directors at the Los Angeles CTO Forum. David, could you give us just a couple of pieces about you, please?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Thanks for the introduction. Bit about me. I started my career a long time ago doing research and development in AI and machine learning. And the only reason I mention that is to mention that I actually hated doing research and development. And from there, transitioned to building real products. I was an engineer, built products, got more and more senior positions, built teams, then eventually became CTO and chief product officer of a bunch of different companies. And did that for a while, but got to the point where what I really love to do is build teams that build products, and then founded Interna about 7 years ago. And we help companies think better about how product management engineering should work, how to build fast, ship fast, get market feedback, very much the lean startup model. So that's what I've devoted my time to the last 7 years, and glad to be here.
Excellent. We're very lucky to have you here. So obviously it's very early for David at the moment in Los Angeles. David is willing for me to jump in during this presentation and ask any questions that you guys may have. So please use the ask a question option just below the video to submit your questions. Any remaining at the end of the presentation we'll go through then as well. So I'll let David kick off and talk about critical judgments for CTOs in the current recession. Let me just get your slides up. And yes, please go ahead, David, whenever you're ready.
Great, thank you. So before I dig in, I just wanted to, I give you a little about my background. My context is very much, the way I think is very much about product management and engineering together as one team. And thinking about them is how do they release products that create value for some markets. So I give you that as the context. I'm not going to, I've got several slides about Interna here, but I'm going to skip those because I want to get into the meat of what we're talking about what you need to think about as a CTO for in this situation, in this recession that we are in. And so I suggest as a CTO, as frankly any executive in a technology company, to start thinking about where you are versus your competitors. Now, normally I don't do this. Normally I suggest think about, as mentioned before, you and the market you serve, the customers you serve, and how you deliver value, and be very, very customer centric. But in this case, the world is different. And I ask you to start by looking at you versus your competitors to have a context of what's going on and where your market is. And that those judgments are going to formulate what you do, what your whole company does, but particularly what you do in engineering, what you do in product management, and how you think about it. So I hold there's a 2x2 matrix. And the 2x2 matrix is where are you at versus where your customers are at. And the happy one, the top left one, I'm okay, they're okay, tells you something about your market and where you are. And you can reason out the other four, but the bottom right one, where you're both at, not so good. And so my suggestion is you start by looking. Sorry, I went the wrong way. You start by thinking about where you are at customers, and I want you to think very much first initially, and maybe many of you have done this, is what do we do to just survive? Where do we go from this, what might be a very much downward spiral for you, your company, and just how you get to an even level playing field. And so I'm going to go through all these 4 quadrants and suggest strategies for each of them, and we'll talk about how that relates in an engineering standpoint. So in the top quadrant, you're okay and your competitors are okay. That implies something about your market, and it's obviously implies that it's good. And the question is it good temporarily, or is it good permanently? So permanently might be your Zoom, and the world is moving to online meetings and may not stay at this level, but is going to be much better than it was when we entered this crisis. AWS, Azure are both going to continue to be better. In that case, my suggestion is think about your engineering department and investing in it and doing more, which might be counterintuitive, but you're playing for the long term. And so my suggestion is think about, how do we hire more? How do we bring more people in? How do we grow it? How do we think about architectures in a way that are going to be long-lived? If it's temporary, you're the mobile dog groomer, not quite the engineering metaphor. Life is better for you for a little while, but not when we come out of this recession. And so the question is how do you build very, very quickly to get value off the table very, very quickly, but not necessarily sustainably? Because you need to, the gold's only going to be there for a little while, and you need to collect it while it's there. On the bottom left quadrant, where you're okay and your competitors are not, this is a very interesting place, because you have the opportunity to take market share. And so in that case, the question is you ought to also build very, very quickly here, but you want to build integrations and create features so that you can get them, your market to switch from your competitors to you. And some of those times you're going to make bad engineering decisions. I'm going to encourage you to make bad engineering decisions because you need to get them in. You also need to be thoughtful about the things that you're going to do that are going to be long lasting. So this is actually a difficult quadrant, because some things you have to do quickly and poorly, and some things you have to do in a sustainable manner. Because you don't want your customers to come and then dislike the experience. You're trying to cover the field, so you gain as much market share as you can from your competitors while you can. Because when the world gets better, the thesis is that what they were good at before, they probably will still be good at, but they haven't been able to invest. So those are quadrants 1 and 2, the top left and the top right. The top left and the bottom left. The top right quadrant, you're aft, but your competitors are good. They're going to try to do to you what you might do to them in the reverse situation. And here you've got to find a safe strategy. And this is just about as much about product as it is about engineering. Is you've got to find a place where your market is protected, and then you have to double down, build product, build engineering behind that. So something that you're very good at, it's very hard for your competitor to displace, and you need to stop almost all other engineering work and just work there, because you're under attack. And sooner or later, the market will come back. I have no idea how long this recession is. I don't think anybody does, but maybe quite a long time. So you need to be able to do that and be able to sustain your company while we're in the recession, and be able to go and live another day. Now, I'm talking about this for technologists in technology companies, as opposed for technologists that are in IT operations in a company that does something else, like a grocery store. And the reason I say that, and the reason I make that distinction, is if you're a technologist, if you run an engineering organization in a technology company, you create the lifeblood of revenue for that company. You are a profit center. So you, by being protective like this in any of these strategies, you have the ability to sustain and to help your company survive or grow in these bad times. Where if you're in an IT organization, a company that's not a technology company, then you're just a cost center, and people are going to try to cut you. So anyway, we've talked about 3 of the quadrants. There's one quadrant left. This is not a very happy one, where both you and your competitors are in bad shape. And the question I ask here is the same question I asked in the top left quadrant, which is this temporary or is this permanent? Now, both you and your competitors being in bad shape says something about your market. And if it's temporary and the market's going to come back after the recession's over, you need to severely cut now and just hold things together. Have the minimum staff you can have to hold things together and wait for the market to come back. You start a little before that, but there's not much you can do here. The fundamental question is, if this is permanent, you not only have to cut your engineering staff, and by the way, I know that's painful, but you have to think about, with the remaining people you have, how can I migrate to a different market? What can I do adjacent? How can I reuse my engineers for something that will create value for someone else? It's really hard to cut people. It's really, really painful. And for your people, if you're going to furlough them, and in countries where you don't have furloughs, if there's going to be a layoff, you need to do it and do it once. It's really, really hard to do. People tend to want to be very, very conservative. But what happens if you have to cut twice or three times? People get very frustrated. Their morale is going to go down if you cut them if some people get cut anyway. But my suggestion is figure out how to do it once, which means you probably need to cut your engineers deeper than you might like to. If you're in the left side, then you shouldn't just grow your engineering staff, but you should do it and market it. It helps your product, but it also helps you attract other engineers. There will be engineers in the market that want to go places, but you want your choices, as many of them as possible. And so my suggestion is you should work with whoever your marketing staff is to promote that you are growing. So the question is where are you on the continuum from a company? Survive, which is the cutting. Revive, which is getting to from the cutting to a place where the group is healthy. We'll talk about that in a second. And then in the end, to keep growing the company again. So, as I mentioned, if you have to put people on furlough, people are going to be unhappy, and you're going to be doing worse as an engineering team. Morale is going to be down. No one likes it. No, nobody should like it. Your product demands are going to go up. Remember, I suggested a minute ago that you might have to move to another product line, or you might have to dig deeper and defend your position, which means that you have to actually build more than you might suspect you might have to. But you've lost a lot of people, so things are going to be harder to do. You're going to have lost knowledge. And so it's going to feel like you've done this wrong, right? It's slower. You've got more demands. People aren't feeling well. There is no way to do this right. So the question then becomes, what do I do to be successful? If I have these needs, if I have those needs where I'm one of the right two columns and I've got to do more work with fewer people, then the question is, how do I do it? And my answer is the things you should be doing now are the things that you should have been doing them all along. And this is very much, and this is where it becomes much more engineering centric and product centric. This is very much about how do you think in a lean way? How do you build in an agile way? And what your people are focused on. And this is the only way out of this problem. And so start about thinking about who do you serve? Who is your market and what do they want? And product management and engineering need to think about their job is to build products that satisfy their market. If you're in a situation where your product managers think their job is to write user stories or product roadmaps, and that's their job, they've got it wrong. And you're going to be really hurt. It's bad in every market. You're going to be really hurt in this market. If your engineers think their job is to write code, and that they write code based on what they're told to do, and that's their job, and if they're told to do the wrong thing, it's not on them, you got a real problem. They have to think that their job is to building product, and they need to focus on not just that micro part of their job, building code, writing user stories, that kind of thing, but how do I build and ship small things quickly? This is the gospel of the lean startup methodology, but it's even more important now. It's more important because you don't really know what the market wants. All product managers are bad at their job. They're bad at their job because it's not a job you can be good at. So you've got to build stuff and release stuff quickly and be able to explore what the market wants by the release and get the feedback and do it again and again. And the engineers, particularly in this market, have got to be very good at delivering small increments of code, even bad code, so they can get something out there so they can explore the requirement space by release and feedback. And so your engineers, particularly in this market, need to be comfortable with writing crappy code. And you as a manager need to be comfortable with letting them do that, but also giving them permission to always refactor. So the second time they go into the code base, they need to not ask you permission to refactor. The only sustainable way of doing this is letting them, when they're in there, letting them refactor. As a matter of fact, telling them not to ask permission to refactor, just to refactor every time they release. And I know this is the way people talk about that they should operate generally. Most teams don't operate this way, particularly on refactoring. But it's critical into this market, whether you're in the bad situation on the right, in the top right quadrant, where you've got to defend your position, or whether you're on the situation on the left, where you're reaping or sowing and investing. As a matter of fact, it may be harder if you're investing. But here's something that most people forget. People do retros. Some people do retros well, but a lot of people do retros very poorly. But retros are not just for how did I do coding in this sprint? How did I do against the user stories that we said are going to be in this sprint? Or if you're in Kanban or Scrumban, how are we doing getting things down the Kanban board? People know that, but people often forget is 2 or 3 weeks after a release, you need to ask yourself, did the thing we put out in the market have the effect on the market that we thought it was going to? You need to retro not only your software development process, but your product management process. And because your product managers and your engineers are jointly invested in the release of the product and creating value for the market, the product managers and the engineers should have a say in whether it's been successful. Now, the next question you might ask is successful compared to what? And successful compared to what is before any user story, or particularly any epic, is being built, the product managers need to describe to the engineers and the rest of the company, but particularly the engineers, we believe by doing this epic for this type of user, we're going to have this effect on them. And we'll know it when we see the metrics move. And your engineers should refuse to do any epic unless that's stated to them for 2 reasons. One is there's 3-4 ways of writing code for any story. Unless they know the context, they're not going to be able to consistently pick the right one. That's reason 1. Reason 2, because if you believe, as I do, that all product managers are bad at their job, we can't retro something unless we know what the thesis was by which we decided to do it. And so retroing the release 3 weeks after it's out there, or 2 weeks or 4 weeks, you need to pick the proper increment for your company, allows the engineers and the product managers, the ones that should be deeply interested in whether they're serving well your market. Only by having that are they able to evaluate that. And particularly if you go back to this chart, and you're saying that you have a particular strategy, whether it's building the moat and hiding behind it and doubling down, trying to displace the competition, reaping or sowing, everything, you need to speak directly with your engineers about the strategy and why and where the company is. And all of those epics need to address which quadrant you're in and how you think about this. You need to be very forthright with the engineers, whether your situation is good or bad, because they need to have the context of what they're doing and why they're doing it. They're going to ask you, why are you asking me to build crappy stuff? I hate this. And they need to understand the context of why and whether it means survival for the company or opportunities for the company to grow. And they also need to understand how do I not just have a loaded tech debt when we're done? Why this strategy works and how they have the ability to refactor something in the second and the third go at it after you've proven by the retros from the product whether it's worthwhile investing in that again. They need to understand the context of the company and the market and where you're at and why you're doing it. Otherwise, there's no way that they're going to be successful in doing this. And they need to be attuned to doing this and doing this quickly and reducing the cost of release. Because going back to that same theme, if you believe all product managers are bad at their job, and if you believe a release is an exploration of the requirement space, then you should want to do that as quickly as possible. So they need to spend time. You need to give them time to automate the release process, automate the QA process as much as you can, so you can run through this as quickly as possible. You have fewer people than you had a day ago if you're on the right two sides. And so they need to be even more efficient than they were before. And so you need to spend time and let them have that time doing that so you can explore the requirement space as fast as possible. So that discusses things if you're on those right two quadrants where you're in a bad situation and maybe your competitors are, maybe you aren't. But if you're in one of the left two quadrants where you're in a good situation, my suggestion is just the same. And then you need to operate quickly. If you're in the top left quadrant where you're in a good situation, your competitors are too, they're going to also be trying to position themselves to take over as much market share on a permanent basis as possible. You can see this going back to Zoom. Google Meet is now free for folks. Facebook has a conferencing app that's now free for everybody. They're attacking Zoom. Now, I think Zoom is a better product myself, but that means Zoom has to move even faster. And the same techniques that work on the right side work on the left side for them. If you're in the bottom left quadrant, where you're doing okay and your competitors are not, you don't know how long this recession is going to last. This may be the best quadrant to be in for you, the bottom left, but you still want to operate quickly because you want to take as much market share over as you can until this thing ends. So those are my suggestions about how to think about where you are and what to do if you're in engineering and product management. As you can see that much of this is generic to anywhere you are in anywhere you are in the country, but the specific techniques in engineering and product management, specific agile techniques that you might use are even more important, even more appropriate now. And so my suggestion is, if you don't know them and don't know how to think about it, and not just the agile techniques, Scrum or Kanban or Scrumban or XP or whatever you might like, but also how you manage the engineering teams, the product management teams, how you bring them together to that they understand that they're one team and their goal is to create value for your customer base, and how they think about that value and how they measure that value. If you're not on that page, you should get on that page as soon as possible. It's even more important now. That's what I got for you. Ready for questions.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much for that, David. So then, so as you're going through there, essentially it's not just an engineering team change, but a company level change that you're discussing here, isn't it?
Yes.
Would you say? Okay,
yes.
Fantastic. So everyone, please feel free to ask your questions. I've got a couple lined up here, definitely. So one of the interesting ones that I saw there is where your competitors are doing okay, but we're in a bad place. And you were talking about trying to get behind what's good about your product and your business and trying to stay behind that. Should the business not be considering why their competitors are succeeding and you're not?
Absolutely. And that question, there's a short-term and a long-term part of that question. Has it always been this way? In which case, engineering changes may not be able to help you very much. You might have another systemic problem in your organization. Sales group is bad, or marketing, or something like that. Maybe you have a bad CEO. That doesn't relieve you of an obligation in the engineering department to do the best you can to create a moat and hide behind it. But yes, it is a systemic question. But you also have to ask the question is, what can we do in engineering, whether we're the cause of the issue, maybe you are, maybe you're not, or whether you're just the victim of it.
Sure. Okay, brilliant. And going back to the crappy code example that you give. So obviously, being a lot of us are probably developers originally, we hate crappy code. We're trying to avoid that. Why are you suggesting this? What type of risks do you need to be aware of? And how would you actually execute when you tell your team, write back crappy code, I don't care.
Yeah.
So
yeah, and to be fair, and Angelos asked this question, says crappy feels like a strong word. To be fair, I use it in two meanings. One is I purposely use an extra strong word because I want people to be aware that they need to make choices. You can think about crappy in this context in one of two ways, and I suggest you think about both. Is if you really don't know whether this feature is going to be useful or not, then build crappy code. Like build the smallest possible thing you can get, but iterate really, really quickly. Because if you find out that people want it, you better come behind it really quickly and fix it and make it so it's not crappy. But the other question I think is crappy code. Think of crappy code and crappy feature together, which is to say, build the minimum feature, and just to get out there to be able to test it. So in this case, in this second case, what crappy means is not poor quality code, but really minimal feature set, good code behind it. But build the smallest things so you're not investing in building, over-architecting the thing that you're building. So in one case, it's build crappy code because you have no idea if something wants, you just need to do something quick with the commitment that you're going to iterate right after that release. Or in the second case, it's building the smallest, crappiest feature set with good quality code if you're more sure. And then you have to iterate on the feature.
Sure. And the biggest pushback I would normally see related to this would normally come from like the CEO level, where they're like, I want this feature, and they expect it to be all encompassing. Well, obviously your approach is saying start small. How do you sell the value of this iterative approach to the other C-levels normally outside of the technical sector?
So this is, it depends who you're speaking to. If you're speaking to, it depends who your CEO. It primarily depends who your CEO is. If your CEO has not been an engineer or a product manager before, and most of them have not, then typically they've come through a sales side. And what I say to them is, I start with, we cannot perfectly predict what the market is. We wish we could, but we can't. And so we're probably directionally correct, but not specifically correct. So how long do you want me to take to develop this feature to figure it out? I am glad to, engineers would like to do the perfect architecture. I would like to do the perfect architecture. It's going to take me this long, or I can get something out in shorter. What do you think makes sense? I wouldn't talk to the CEO about refactoring. Another way of doing it in a metaphorical way, and this depends very much on your relationship with the CEO, if you can do it this way, is particularly if they've been in sales. So when you do your sales forecast, every company you put on there that you're going to sell to, you get 100% of them, right? And of course they don't. You can't, right? And so they're making a lot of bets, and the metaphor is, I'm going to make a lot of bets as well. And we're going to have a conversation about it, and my bets are going to be thoughtful, but some are going to be wrong.
Okay, excellent. And you're identifying those that are wrong early in the process, so you don't wait 6 months for the product to be delivered.
That's exactly right. Now,
excellent.
Here's the question you didn't ask me, is wrong compared to what? And in a B2C company, it's much easier to do than a B2B company. Because in a B2C company, your usage is measurable, and what effect that has on retention is measurable. On a B2B company, the retention is related to usage, but might be related to something else as well, or it might be an aggregation of several features to get it to be sticky. And
Sure.
so this is where the relationship between product management and engineering is more critical, because in the first situation, B2C, your only data source in really is whatever you instrument on the product and how they use it. In a B2B company, the product managers have got to be much more of an outside person and getting information. Some of it is objectively measured and some of it's subjectively measured about, is this helping sales? Are we getting more leads? And it's an aggregation. And then the job of product manager becomes harder. And the conversation between product management and engineering becomes harder, because it's not just all data, right? Some of it is subjective, and some of that feedback loop takes a little bit of a longer time.
Okay, excellent. Yeah, definitely. Considering the B2B and B2C aspects, different risks and different considerations are needed in those cases. Okay, so going back to your quite strong statement of all product managers are bad.
Yes.
Is there a place for them in their in the business, and what do you mean by that? Could you extend a little bit further?
Yeah. So, I think they're critical. I think you can't do the job without them. I'm just saying, expecting a product manager to be Steve Jobs, they're not. They can't do that. But they could be. Any particular bet might be wrong, but the aggregation of bets over time should get better and should be right. So I expect them to be bad at saying, this is particularly the feature people want to use in this exact way, and build it in this exact way, and I know. But I also know the number of Steve Jobs that currently exist in the universe. There used to be one, and now there are zero. And by the way, Apple also developed a bunch of bad products they don't talk about. Like the first iPhone, the first phone they had with iTunes built into it was a Motorola Rocker. It was horrible. And probably none of you guys remember it, or very few of you do, because they don't market the crappy stuff. Right? So I was once talking with Evan Spiegel, the CEO of Snapchat, and this was when they were just on their growth curve and they'd just gone public and things were great. And I said, Evan, like, your life is awesome. Like, you guys are just like, everything's right. And he told me exactly the same thing. He goes, no, we just don't market. We just don't tell you the stuff that we screwed up. We screwed up a lot of stuff. Right?
Definitely. Great point.
And right. So, but so what you want is a learning product manager, and one who knows how to iterate quickly, and the one who makes more good bets than bad bets, and makes more and more good bets over time, and understand. I want my product managers to understand something about engineering so they can say, help me understand about that architecture and why you're building that. Could we do it this way? The same way I want my engineers to understand about the product and say, why are we doing that? Either it doesn't make sense to me, or I can do 80% of that 20% of the time, and I can add this other thing because I have empathy for our users, right? I want the engineers to have an opinion about the product the same way I want the product managers to have an opinion about architectures. The product managers don't get to make the architectural calls. At the end of the day, the engineers don't get to make the product calls, but they get to have an opinions and to be heard.
Sure, absolutely. And setting up a business organization that allows that communication to take place is definitely going to become much more vital as we go forward. So, yeah, and as Christopher just mentioned, use the trading terminology to also cut your losses, remove the bad bets, as an example they've just given there. Okay, great. So with different company sizes then, so if you're dealing with a company with a small team versus a multi-team organization, does the advice differ? Do you change the approach in any way?
So if you're the CTO of a bigger company, it's about imbuing these ideas into your team and empowering them, and not wrapping their knuckles when they make some bad bets. They're going to make some bad bets. The aggregate should be good, right? But they need to have bad bets, and you need to ask them about the bad bets and what they learned, because it's the learning that's important here. In a smaller company, if you're the CTO and maybe there's 20 engineers or 10 engineers or 40 engineers, then you have much more direct control over this. And you can be maybe not at 40 engineers, but certainly at 20 engineers, you can pepper yourself into the retros. You can't be in all of them, and be there and be a symbol of, oh, that's interesting. I think, oh, well, that's interesting. What happened there? Or if things went better than you expected, also asking the same question. That's interesting. What did you learn there? But being a symbol of, we're doing inquiry here, is important. It's also important to know when not to be in the room, because as CTO, being in the room, you're being in the room changes the room, right? So you need to be able to think about, when are you in the room? How do you ask questions? And what do you reward? So I had this admin who worked for me years ago, and she had worked for someone before me this guy must have been brilliant. And this admin made some mistake that cost the company $50,000. She told me the story. And she went to her boss and said, I did this thing and it cost the company $50,000. And I'm really sorry. She was a great person. I'm really, really sorry. And I know this must be my last day at the company. I just wanted to apologize and let you know. And he turned to her and said, what do you mean your last day at the company? And she said, well, you're going to fire me, right? He said, why would I fire you? I just invested $50,000. I bet you never make that mistake again. Right?
Absolutely.
And that's exactly the right conversation to have. If a person is making an earnest bet and makes a mistake for something that was unknowable, that's sad, but we're okay.
Yeah.
If someone makes a mistake for something that was knowable and doesn't consistently, then you have a different question to ask.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, the safety of being open, honest, and transparent is very important. The first thing I do when I go into a company is I tell all the people I'm working with about my worst mistake. I don't want to share it publicly, but it's a doozy. It's a great one. But essentially gives them confidence that, okay, it's not going to be as bad as that. So essentially they feel much more comfortable to raise it.
I just introduced them to my wife. She has a whole list of my mistakes.
Yeah, we're just seeing some examples. Drop database without backups enabled. Yeah, so right then. So one of the interesting things I'd like to get your opinion on. Obviously, you're based in the US. You see a lot of the market over here, and here we furlough a lot of staff. But obviously, some businesses have removed staff as well. Do you believe companies had too much of a knee-jerk reaction to remove staff from their companies too quickly when this first hit?
You know, I think some people did it in a way that wasn't thoughtful. And so I've got a client right now. I happen to have a client in London, but I've got a client in Boston, and they did something that was very smart. Hopefully I was helpful in this, is scenario planning. Before you make a decision is, what are the 3 or 4 ways this can turn out for you? You might find those 3 or 4, maybe 5 ways that what you need to do in 2 or 3 of the ways are very similar. So the world is going to end. Things are going to be really bad for us, but good for our competitors. We might have to do the same thing for both of them. Then you ask yourself, when do we get the data point by which we know which of these 3, 4, or 5 scenarios we're going to use, and we're going to figure out how to make the decisions around them. And many companies didn't do scenario planning. They didn't think about what the possibilities are. They just said, we need to decrease our burn and increase the time we're going to raise till we raise. Some companies were thoughtful, but many weren't. It is for certain kinds of companies. I work also with investors, VCs, and private equity firms, because sometimes they ask us to come in. There's 4 of us, and they ask us to come in and do diligence on deals. Some of these companies are going to have a hard time doing a raise. And so they need to think about when's their next raise, and they need to cut so they can get there. By the way, there's an interesting relationship between product management, engineering, and fundraising, which is when you do a capital raise, the investors want to say, what's the significant thing that's occurred in the business, the significant positive thing since you did the last raise. So if you release once a month, and let's say you have 12 months of burn, you got 12 opportunities to create new value. If you release once a week, you have 48 opportunities to create new value. That's 48 opportunities to learn. If you release once a day, you have 240 opportunities. If you release multiple times a day, well, then you can do the multiplication yourself, right? So engineering and product management and the speed of release is critical to do that next fundraise, because you want to learn quickly.
Absolutely. Yeah, excellent. So I mean, essentially my view is that companies thought, okay, this is 2-3 months, cut costs right now, and things will be fine again after. As the approach that you're discussing here is very much about, you need to still be investing to do these trials, to work out what markets you can fall into, what products you can generate. Otherwise, you're never going to move until a vaccine's available or everything's back to normal, which we don't know if it ever will be. So right. Essentially,
right.
you've
might
paused.
Never happen.
Exactly, it might never happen. Okay, great. So one that's a question that's interesting on my side, very personal. So obviously, I work in offshore agency, and what do you think the effects are going to be for more businesses wanting to utilize remote or offshore companies? So CEOs may want to cut costs, less expensive developer hours. Do you expect a higher increase in this? Do you think that's the right way businesses should be moving?
So there will be additional pressure to reduce the developer hour cost. And so there will be more CEOs trying to push people offshore to offshore agencies where the cost per developer hour is cheaper. In some situations, that's going to make sense. In some, it's not. Many CEOs do not understand the place where it's appropriate to go offshore and where it's not. And I distinguish here offshore versus nearshore. So here in the States, doing work in Mexico, Brazil, or Argentina is a lot easier than doing work in India, because India is 12 and a half time zones away, and these other places are 1, 2, 3, 4 time zones away. If you're doing work that is easily specified and not likely to be dynamic, not likely to have to change, 2 APIs need to connect together, for instance, going offshore is a great choice. If you have stuff that is going to change a lot, or you have to communicate a lot, then going offshore is much harder, unless you can also move product management offshore. If you can move product management and engineering together, because once again, I view them as one team and it's a high bandwidth communication, then it's easier to move stuff to a different location, so long as that the people in that location understand something about the market. Now, staff aug, where you have some offshore people that pair with your employees, that you can do, right? If you can find an overlap in time where they can work together.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
There's some
Staff
different
org.
models.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. As you say, things that can be separated, low risk, easily scopable and fixed, where you could go to the cheaper areas of the world, like Asian-based companies, where the risk is very low for you, then you could try and get reduced cost. Obviously, anything that's more in-depth about product, about development, and the way your business operates as a core, you need to consider it as one business. Either there's all people in the US with maybe they're remote, but you still can treat them as one team, or staff org, which are other places. Again, the staff org, so the communication's there. They're part of the sprints. They're part of the retros.
Yep.
It's one team, just not in the same place. That's right. I always beware any CEO that purely looks at this at a cost perspective. So because
they're right,
it's not the same
cost you can't see. One of my clients, actually, well, now everybody's company, but a couple of my current clients have been remote only teams forever, for the history of their company, right? And there's certain muscles you need to understand to exercise to do that well. And how do you bring everybody in the room? And right now, staff aug, everybody's remote all the time, and as long as there's some overlapping time zones, you can figure that out. And there's things you got to learn, but they're learnable. Right, but it's a false economy just to say these people are cheaper on a per hour basis, so let's just ship everything there.
Absolutely, yeah. That's not, you don't get the same output whatsoever with that mindset.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So we've got about another 10 minutes left. I mean, I've still got loads of questions left over. If anyone else wants to add some, please feel free to add them in. I'll just go through the last few of mine. Many massive old companies move at a snail pace. So essentially businesses that have been around for 20 plus years, they haven't had to go through large amounts of innovation. They've been pretty stable, obviously being shook up right now. What are your thoughts for incorporating this type of change at these slower moving companies?
Fear is a great factor to make change. And if you're at a technology company, then you're very empowered as being the CTO, because you really do control the revenue of the company by what you do. And I would go back and discuss this kind of opportunity threat matrix that I suggested on the slides with the CEO, and suggest to the CEO that they have to make a call now, or very, very soon, but probably now, because your competitors that are fleet are making this call, and they know that, of course. My other question is the constraint of the big company one that is social, just cultural, or is it bureaucratic? Like there's people in HR that don't allow things to happen. In which case, that's a conversation that I would have with the CEO to say, we have to move now. The market's telling us we have to move now. We're in one of these 4 quadrants. And particularly on the quadrants on the right, if we don't move now, we're going to die. On the quadrants on the left, that's opportunity. And so it might be harder to influence people to move quickly. But in the quadrants on the right, as I said in the beginning, using fear as a motivator is often effective.
Absolutely. What is the business risk if you do nothing?
Exactly.
Essentially with that mindset.
That's exactly right.
Okay. And with the way you answer, you're always discussing this very competitive focused. You're looking at the businesses around you. Shouldn't you be ignoring competitors and focusing on your customers, be customer obsessed? Why are you always looking at the competitors?
I'm only looking at the competitors in this case because of these market conditions. It's interesting to know where the competitors are in other market conditions, because if they're doing something that locks you out of the market, if there's a data monopoly in the market, then it's important to know that how they're doing in gathering the data monopoly. If there's a network effect, it's important to know where they're doing, and so what you need to do to not lose out on that. But in general, I would say you should be customer obsessed. But these are particular market conditions, and where you are versus your competitors give you some information about what's happening to your customers. And so you can think of it as a proxy for that.
Excellent. What happens if, as a business owner or as a CTO, you don't know what your competitors' strengths or weaknesses are? What should you be doing in these cases where you don't know what your competitors are actually up to?
You should damn well figure it out.
And what would be your approach for doing that? Just at a generic level, of course. So.
Oh yeah, it's generic. Well, I would first ask the product managers, right? Product managers, your proxy in the market is, have you played with the competitors' products? Please go do that. Do it quickly. Go understand what they're offering is. Read everything they do. That's part of your job. Let's not fly blind, and you've got to get that figured out to understand where we are, and you have to have empathy. And by the way, your competitors may be doing some stuff that's really creative that you can learn from. Your competitors you might find out your competitors are not, they're in a different segment of the market, and they're helpful, right? They're not, what they're doing is helpful from a knowledge perspective. Perhaps that you can actually cooperate as well. But unless you spend the time to figure out what they're doing, life's going to be hard, because that you just, what did they say about philosophy? It's a blind man in a black room looking for a black cat that isn't there. So you don't want to be that person.
Definitely not. Okay, great. So from the last question, from my perspective then, some of the things you're suggesting need to be company-wide. So I'm a CTO. I've started implementing this process into my part of the engineering team. What if the rest of the company have not taken on these efforts? Should I be kicking, screaming, trying to ensure they're doing the same approach that we are?
I would, as much as you can. Actually, first I'd ask why. Why are they not doing it? Maybe they do know something that you don't know. But let's assume that's not true. Then I would spend time asking what their plan was. I'm very much a believer in asking questions rather than telling. And so by asking questions, you make them thoughtful. And if you do it correctly, they don't have to feel like you're being aggressive. Maybe you learn something that they know something you don't. But then, assuming you don't, I would try to move ahead in the direction anyway and show by example that how you're creating benefit for the company.
Absolutely.
But,
Yeah, I mean, the vision and direction sort of has to come from the top. And essentially, if you don't have that, so if other businesses aren't doing that, then there's definitely a miscommunication somewhere. And you could be right where your own actions are incorrect compared to what the rest of the business is doing. So those conversations need to be had to understand those gaps there. Yep. Okay, excellent. Anything you want to round your talk up with? Any key points that people should take away in their head?
No, the key points are, it's how to use product release as a learning opportunity. And if people have questions afterwards, they should just feel free to reach out to me. I mean, I run a consultancy. Obviously, I'm glad to help people on that basis, but you don't need to have a contractual relationship with me to reach out to me. And I'm just glad to share ideas with people and war stories. So, I know you're going to share my contact information later. People should just feel free to reach out, and I'm glad to chat.
Excellent. Yeah, well, it's been fantastic. It's been a very, very interesting conversation to go through all these pieces. Your slides are very well presented, so thank you very much for that, David. It's great to have you here. So you can connect with David after this event on LinkedIn, Twitter, his direct email even. Essentially, it's all in the chat. So essentially, feel free to contact him there if you've got any follow-up questions. And yeah, our next CTO Craft Bytes session will be next week. We haven't got the event bright link up yet, but keep an eye out for that. I think we should be getting it up tomorrow. And yeah, thank you all for joining. Please, I hope you enjoy the rest of your week. Thank you very much, David.
Thank you.